Hi there. Today I'm going to be talking about tomatoes and how to grow them. Specifically in Louisiana, in the deep south where I live. Now, right now, it is the middle of the day, it is blazing hot, so I'm wearing my hat, even though it's got a hole in it. But this would actually be prime time for picking tomatoes. There are a few ripe, so I may pick them before I go inside. The heat really brings out the flavor in your tomatoes, so rather than picking them first thing in the morning or at dinner time, it might be best to go out in the middle of the day if you're home and pick your tomatoes. When I start tomatoes, I start them inside to get them enough of a head start before the weather outside is ready, and I just start them in a aluminum tin tray that is made for, maybe if you wanted to do a turkey in it or something. It's made to go in the oven, but we weren't going to use it, so I put some dirt in it and I planted my seeds in it, and then I put that tray on a heat mat made for growing seeds, for starting seeds. The heat mat helps the soil to get warm enough to start germination of your seeds, so it ups the likelihood that all of your seeds will germinate. Normally those little plants are then ready to move out of that tray. They're too big long before the climate has prepared for them. So then I might put them into a red solo cup so that they have more room to develop roots. Another good tip is to plant them deeper than they were planted before. Tomatoes were kind of designed, they evolved to grow along the ground and develop roots all along the stem. So anywhere that the stem is touching the soil, those roots will develop and dig into the soil to get more nutrients and to get more water. So if you plant the stem deeper than it was planted before, roots will develop there and it will become a stronger plant. So even though it can be difficult if I have like a 6-inch plant and then I'm moving it into a bigger pot or into the ground, it can be hard to then make it into like a 3-inch plant, but I usually just put it up to where the leaves are, the first leaves on the stem. I pluck those off and I kind of plant at that level, which gives it a good head start. If the nightly temperatures are consistently dipping into the 50s, I will usually hold off putting my plants outside just because they don't really like colder temperatures, so it might slow down their development and their growth. Now there's a couple of tips that you'll often hear about growing tomatoes that I have abandoned this year, so I'll talk about those a little bit and then I will explain why I ultimately abandoned them, even though they're great ideas and you should seriously consider them. So tomatoes are susceptible to fungal diseases, and so there's a number of steps that people take in order to prevent that from happening. They plant their tomato plants far apart so that there's enough airflow to keep the plants dry and to prevent the mold or the fungus from growing. They might also prune a lot of branches off of the plant, the ones that aren't necessary. So a lot of the time people will prune off any branches that are there underneath where the fruit is developing. So from the fruit to the ground, all of those branches are pinched off or cut off. Tomatoes will also grow what are called suckers, and those are kind of a whole plant unto themselves that grows between the main stalk and the branch. So if this is the main stalk of the plant and this is your branch, your leafy branch, a little plant will grow in the middle of it and start to grow nice and big. So a lot of people will pluck those off as well to avoid energy being unnecessarily diverted from the rest of the plant. So just have this one stalk that's growing straight up, and then next to it, at least a foot away, you'll have another. I used to follow all 3 of those tips religiously. I am growing in Louisiana. It's a very humid and wet climate. We get a lot of rain, to the point that I very specifically designed my garden so that none of my plants will ever be sitting in a pool of water. A flat garden is just not going to do it. I don't have raised beds. Maybe if I had raised beds that would change my approach, but I always grow in hills or in furrows. I always make sure that water can run off and go somewhere. Now this week we're not expecting any rain and it's nice and hot, so I'm going to have to water my plants, and I can do that by filling in the furrows with water, so it's not a big deal. But there will be days or weeks when we get 5 inches of rain at a time and the soil can't soak all of it up. We have a lot of clay. It gets very waterlogged. So then my plants are sitting in an inch of water. So you can see why I might be worried about fungal diseases and why I might be very careful about following those rules to mitigate those problems. But I just was never getting a good harvest. So this year I said, I'm not pulling anything off my plants that I don't have to. Let those leaves bring nutrients to the plant, let those suckers develop and hopefully give me fruit. And that's worked. So that's what I'm doing this year. Now, I can't say that those are the only changes I've done this year. A lot of things are different this year, including the weather. The weather has cooperated a little bit better than it did last year. And I still have to be careful about fungal diseases, but so far, none of those have been a considerable problem. And some of the fruit that I'm getting is actually developing on the suckers. So I don't regret that decision at all. A couple things that I am doing to make sure that my plants stay strong and healthy is I am fertilizing them. I have bone meal, blood meal, and I think a Miracle-Gro all-purpose fertilizer that I bought primarily for my indoor plants because I have dogs. But when I ran out of my all-purpose fertilizer, my outdoor all-purpose fertilizer, I've been using Miracle-Gro since then. I am finding, much to my chagrin, that it is very important to fertilize. That anytime you notice your plant starting to kind of slow down production or maybe not look as happy, give them some fertilizer. I'm not saying every week. I've fertilized probably 3 times since February or March, and it's June now, unbelievably. But my cucumbers, for example, that I may show you in another video, they started to slow down as the temperatures picked up, and I thought, okay, maybe it's just too hot for them. But on the off chance, we were expecting some rain, so I put some fertilizer down, and they have been up to peak production ever since. So it's really, really important. I used to think I'm not going to buy fertilizer. I can make compost, so there's no reason to spend money on it. And the truth is that, one, you have to wait for compost to decompose and become compost. And my husband and I just don't produce enough to be enough for my entire garden. And as soon as it's ready, we consume all of it, and it's still not enough for the whole garden, and then you gotta wait a while. So unless you have a really consistent, maybe someday I'll have cows or goats or we are planning to get chickens, but then you still gotta let that decompose. So maybe that'll help in the future, but I would definitely invest in some fertilizer. I use diatomaceous earth, which is a natural pesticide. It works well on soft-bodied insects. It works well on slugs and snails in particular. You can just kind of spread it around the foot of your plant. If you have a serious problem and it rains, you'll have to put it down again. And this year I started using neem oil. It's been working pretty well. I had leaf-footed insects on my cucumbers, for example, and I wasn't sure neem oil was going to work, but I think I sprayed once. And they had one little family of nymphs, and then all of a sudden they all disappeared, which, based on my research, suggests when they consume the oil, when it gets into them, it messes up their chemistry, and they stop eating, or they're not able to lay viable eggs anymore. But it seems to be working really well. I noticed some insects on my tomatoes that were starting to damage my tomatoes, so I sprayed them a couple of days ago, and we'll see if that removes the problem. I did spray the tomatoes earlier in the season too when I started to see some caterpillars. I haven't had any caterpillar problems since then. So I would say that is very effective. It's working really well. The caveat to that is if you're spraying anything on your plants, you want to do it early in the morning or in the evening so that it dries before the sun comes out, but also because you don't want to kill off your beneficial insects. So your beneficial insects are ones that aren't going to eat your plants, but they're predators of the insects that eat your plants. So what I do is I wait until the evening when the beneficial insects have gone to their hives or what have you, and then I spray the plants. I'm also careful to try to not spray flowers because there's some indication that the neem oil could affect bees or anything else that pollinates flowers. So I try to avoid spraying directly on the flowers. And again, I just spray at night so it has plenty of chance to dry before the next day, before sun comes up and the beneficial insects are back. So how am I trellising my tomatoes this year? Buying a grow cage for every single plant can be a lot of money, and it's not something that I have ever gone for. So I'm using a cow panel, which I bought at our local Tractor Supply. and it's just tied to some U-posts with some wire, and that's all that is necessary to put it up. Originally, when I set this up, I thought I might be tying the tomatoes to the fencing, to the panel. What I used to do before the cow panel was use string and a weaving method between the plants. So I would go across, weaving back and forth between each plant, and then on my way back, weave back and forth the opposite way, so like literal weaving. And that held the plants pretty well, but I mean, one year I was using bamboo poles, and those are way too flexible. As soon as the plants got heavy, they just caved, and then the string wasn't useful anymore. Constantly had to tighten it. And then even U-posts, they can kind of give. The string as well can kind of stretch over time. I was just finding it very frustrating, so that's why we went with the cow panel this year. And I originally intended to tie it like most people would to a trellis, but what I ended up doing was just weaving the plant through the bars of the panel, so it kind of holds its own weight. And the only downside to that is if you had a lot more plants than I do, like I only have maybe half as many plants as I did last year, if that. This needs to be checked on regularly. Once the plant is too tall to go into the next gap, you can't make it go without snapping the plant. There is a solution to that problem. If you do snap the plant, because they develop roots anywhere on the stem, you can plant that into the soil, but it will set you back, obviously. But I'm really liking this method this year. Again, it does create that like kind of compressed plant, having to worry about fungal diseases, but so far it hasn't been an issue. Neem oil also might be helping me with fungal diseases. I'm not sure about that. I read somewhere that it could help, but I'm not convinced. There's a bee buzzing around the microphone. Can you hear it? And there's a little hornet down here. Lots of beneficial insects. I have several varieties. I will link below to where I got the seeds. I have this one big plant that was growing in the compost. I think it might have come from a grocery store tomato. I'm not sure what it is. I also have Ukrainian Purple, also known as Purple Russian. I have beefsteak. And this is probably Creole and some kind of grape tomato. Thanks for watching.